In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll explain how to make modifications to a sock heel flap in order to get a good fit. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. So this sock was knit cuffed down with a heel flap and gusset construction. And one thing that's a little unusual about this sock is exactly how long this heel flap is. It's pretty long compared to what you would see in a standard sock pattern for heel flap and gusset construction. And the reason for that is I have a very high instep and very high arch. So I need a longer heel in order to have enough room at this turning point of the sock. So many knitters want to modify their sock patterns in order to create a heel that fits a little better, or maybe they've changed the stitch count and they're not sure how that affects the length of the heel flap that they're supposed to knit, and then how many stitches that they're supposed to pick up along the edge of the heel flap when they're ready to resume working in the round and do the gusset decreases. So that's what I'm going to offer today, is a couple of different ways to approach heel flap length, and then also the golden rule for picking up stitches along the side of the heel flap. There are a couple of approaches for working a heel flap. Typically, the heel is worked over 50% of the stitches. So if you have a 64 stitch sock, you'd work the heel flap over half of those, which is 32 stitches. Now, so the classic length of a heel flap is determined by how many stitches you have on the needles. So if you have 32 stitches, which is what I had in this heel flap, then you would work it for 32 rows. And you'll be working in this particular stitch pattern, this heel stitch pattern, which is on right side rows, you alternate between slipping a stitch and knitting a stitch all the way across, and then on wrong side rows you'd slip the first stitch and then purl across, and that creates this kind of really cushy fabric that sort of resembles ribbing but isn't quite the same thing. So when you slip every other stitch on the right side rows, you end up with these enlarged stitches that kind of come forward, and those are the slip stitches, and then in the valleys are the stitches that were worked every row. So you can count the number of slipped stitches to know how many rows you've worked. Every slip stitch you see represents 2 rows. Now even the selvage stitches are slipped. So if you've worked 32 rows, then you're going to have 16 selvage stitches later where you're going to be picking up your stitches. Now the instructions for picking up stitches, your pattern might specify a specific number of stitches to pick up along the edge if they've told you to knit a specific number of rows. And typically the correlation is if they told you to knit 32 rows, so that you'd have 16 slip stitches, they're going to tell you to pick up 16 stitches along that selvage. So for every selvage stitch that you have, you're going to be picking up 1 stitch. So another way of working the heel flap is to actually specify a particular length. And so for an 8-inch circumference sock, a pattern might tell you something like to knit the heel flap to 2.5 inches, and then they might tell you, and then they would still tell you to pick up 1 stitch for every slip stitch selvage. They may not direct you to pick up a specific number like 17 or 18 or something like that. They would just tell you pick up 1 for every selvage stitch, and that is assuming that these are slipped and that you are working in this heel stitch pattern. Another option that some knitters use is, rather than knitting the heel to a specific length, they might knit the heel until it's square. And the way they tell it's square is when the stitches are on the needle like this, they fold their knitting down to where the heel started, and if it's perfect triangle, then they know that the heel flap itself is square. And that's going to give you a heel flap that's a little longer than if you were to just knit the number of rows that you have, the same number of rows that you have stitches. You're going to get a longer heel flap, and it's more likely to fit well, and you don't have to know a specific measurement to knit to. If you're knitting socks that are in different circumferences, that will likely get you a heel that will fit more people. My preference, though, is to knit the heel to be the correct length for the person who's going to be wearing the sock. So I've done a video before on what to measure on your foot for a sock like this. And one of the measurements that you take is to measure from the middle of your ankle bone, the outer ankle bone, not the one that's on the inside of your ankle, but the outside. Measure from the middle of there down to the floor. And for me, that measurement is 2 3/4 inches. My ankle, though, is quite small in proportion to that heel length. So if I were to use that sort of standard method of working as many rows as I have stitches on the needle, I would end up with a heel flap that was about 1 3/4 inches. If I knit the heel flap until it was square, it would be about 2 1/4 inches long. It would still be it would be quite a bit longer, and it would fit better, but it wouldn't fit as well as actually knitting my heel flap to the length of my heel. So I knit a heel flap that's 2 3/4 inches long, and then I pick up 1 stitch for every selvage stitch along the edge. Now the reason this works with heel stitch is because heel stitch has a compressed row gauge and also compressed stitch gauge. So here's a swatch that's knit in stockinette where I put some garter border just to make it lie flat. This swatch is 32 stitches wide and it's 32 rows long, just like the heel flap that I worked. But what you'll notice about this heel flap is that it is quite a bit shorter, so the row gauge is far more compressed than it is with stockinette. And it's also narrower than stockinette stitch. So you can make your heel flap square and it's not going to be enormous in either length or width because the gauge has been so much more compressed. And because the row gauge is more compressed than it is with regular stockinette, that's why you can pick up 1 stitch for every 2 rows or 1 stitch for every slip selvage stitch and have it be exactly the right amount of stitches. You can knit a wearable sock using any of the methods I've shown, but you'll get the best results by knitting the heel flap to the length of the recipient's actual heel. If that length is not available, the square heel is really the next best option. Regardless of the method you choose, the pickup rate at the heel flap edge will always be 1-to-1 when using the heel stitch pattern. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.